Hello everyone, this is Dr. Houck with the discussion video for the first module assignment. You'll want to have your copy in front of you. Hopefully by listening to this and going over your own work, you'll be able to see where you had points deducted, if in fact you had points deducted. In regard to the identification and short answers, by the way, it's not important that you necessarily state things precisely the way I'm saying them in these discussion videos, but you need to be somewhere in the ballpark. Okay? And of course, if you have any questions, you can always contact me. Alright, let's take it from the top. Module assignment number 1, the first section. The transition towards cultural relativism began, that'd be D, 1900. In fact, that is when fieldwork became popular, in the year 1900. That's just a nice sort of round number to use for the time when that began. Number 2, that would be C, enculturation, according to my reading on spirit possession, is the most significant explanatory tool, and that should have been evident from the reading. Number 3, again from the material that I wrote, that would be B. If their soul is displaced and it doesn't return, then they think they will die. And then 4, D. Actually, 3 of those are conceptually somewhat on the same page, and 1 is not. And that would be D, pluralism. Number 5. According to Hahn's notion of sickness, the most important perspective is that of the individual. That should have been pretty clear from your reading in the Hahn textbook. So 5 is B. Number 6, that would be C, again according to Hahn. Number 7, A. And that's because only in the exclusionist model do they consider culture-bound syndromes to be a valid interpretation. The other 2 models don't quite go that far. So 7 is A. Number 8, on necessary and sufficient causes. Let's look at this, and in case you had any problems, let's talk about it. The situation is that factor A combines with factors B, C, R, D, or E to cause sickness. Which of the following is true? Well, the answer is C, but let's look at each one. A is a sufficient cause? No, it's not sufficient because other things have to be present. What about choice B? It says C is a necessary cause. Again, not true, because it can either be B, C, D, or E. And of course, C is the answer. A is a necessary cause, just meaning that A must be present. That is true. And then choice D says E is sufficient. Well, that one's not true for the same reason that B is not true. Namely, that you need much more than just the presence of E. Alright. Number 9, according to the Hahn reading that you did, that will be A. And then number 10, again, according to the discussion you found in Hahn, that will be B. Okay, true, false. Number 11, any claim or statement that is non-falsifiable is true. Well, that statement is false. If it's non-falsifiable, it simply means just that. No data can be brought to bear on the truth or falsity of the claim. So therefore, as I like to say, it sort of hangs out there in this ether of uncertainty. So we simply don't know. So it's false as written. Number 12, No, they certainly don't, according to my video lecture. We don't speak of language as being superior or inferior. We do speak of languages as being functional and proper given the given context, but that's as far as it goes. Number 13, yes, that's according to the reading that you did on spirit possession that I wrote for my book. That is true. Number 14, nosologies. These are classifications of sickness. They tend to be similar cross-culturally. No, they tend to be quite different from culture to culture. Number 15, and by the way, you can find information for number 15 on page 21 in the Han reading. That would be true. Number 16, all medical systems around the world are cultural to some extent. Yeah, some more cultural than others. Biomedicine, the one that we engage in, tends to be on the less cultural side of the spectrum. Number 17, that is correct. According to Han, and actually most people who study ethnomedicine, no sickness is strictly culture-bound. There is some universality, in other words, to all sickness. Number 18, if both factors A and B must be present for a sickness to occur, we would say that either factor is sufficient. Well, no. If you change sufficient to necessary, then it would be true. But it can't be sufficient if it requires the presence of something else. So 18 false. Number 19, that is true. That's just basically the definition of the emic perspective, as opposed to the outsider's perspective, the Edic perspective. In this case, the emic perspective. True. Number 20, yes, according to, now note how I worded the question, certainly not according to anthropologists, and certainly not according to, let's say, epidemiologist or whatever. Right? But according to the Aborigines themselves, yes, sorcery is all that is required. And that's what we mean by necessary and sufficient. True. Number 21, that is false. According to Han, he sees all these factors as playing important roles and really doesn't seem to downplay one any more than the other. Number 22, this is also true. I didn't mean to say also, this is true. According to Han, the presence of a pathogen is not enough to give us sickness. There has to be something else going on, namely enculturation, or I should say the interpretation which comes from enculturation. All right, 23. These are fill in the blank. Make sure you spell these terms correctly. Culture relativism. Culture relativism. Number 24, dissociation. That's because psychologists and social scientists generally do not accept the spirit possession diagnosis for what is generally referred to as possession culturally. So dissociation. Number 25, this came from the chapter you read from my book, Umbanda. Umbanda. It's practiced in Brazil. U-M-B-A-N-D-A. 26 is Kuru. K-U-R-U. 27, Obeamen. O-B-E-A-H-M-E-N. 28, Voodoo Death. 29, Enculturation. Identification, cultural absolutism. If you actually just write the converse of the definition of cultural relativism, then you'll get pretty close to what we need here. Cultural absolutism is the idea that one culture does serve as the standard by which you can judge other cultures, and that culture tends to be the person's own. Logical positivism. This is a perspective that argues that true knowledge can be obtained only from things like experimentation, measurement, hypothesis testing, and other empirical methods. In other words, true knowledge must be falsifiable. A Mongba is a male priest in the Orisha religion. And xenocentrism is essentially the opposite of ethnocentrism. Xeno, which refers to strange or other or foreign. And so xenocentrism would be considering a culture other than one's own to be the standard culture by which others are to be judged. Right? So you're totally putting an emphasis and focus on a culture other than your own and using that culture as a standard. 34. Culture-bound syndrome. Any malady or condition thought to be endemic to a particular area or particular people, in simple terms. Psychologization. This is the situation where one takes a purely physiological or physical condition and interprets it as a psychological condition. Hence psychologization. So it's the psychologization of a physiological ailment. So for example, Christian Science does this. At least, according to someone maybe who's not a Christian Scientist, because they consider virtually all sickness to be a spiritual matter. So that would be an example. Occam's razor, there's a few different ways to describe this. I think that the way that I probably did in my video and the way I usually talk about it in my class is that when faced with a bizarre occurrence, we should first exhaust all natural explanations before resorting to supernatural explanations. And of course, in popular culture, people break this rule all the time. Another way to look at it is the simplest explanation is the most likely explanation. Okay, 37, the short answers. State what you think is the best critique of the term supernatural. There's a few ways you could go about this. James Lett, that you read about, argued that the term is nonsensical. But you have to say more. Why is it nonsensical? You can't just say it's nonsensical. You need to say more than that. It's nonsensical. Why? According to some. Well, we can't access it. We can't experience it. In other words, it lies beyond our experiential purview. And so therefore it doesn't make any sense to talk about it at all. That's one way to approach it. Also, too, it was noted that some cultures don't recognize the concept. In other words, some cultures don't delineate between the natural and the supernatural. It's all one unified whole. So since they don't differentiate between the two, they don't have the term, and they don't recognize the term. Okay, 38. This has to do with anthropologists and language. They don't make value judgments. Well, then how do they evaluate speech in certain contexts? Well, it has everything to do with functionality and pragmatism. Speech is evaluated in its context. So you can take any dialect you want, and as long as people are using that in that speech community, in other words, they're saying what they want to say and people understanding what they're saying, then they're totally functional. Okay, so pragmatism and functionality are important there. Number 39. Towards the end of that chapter on spirits and spirit possession, there are a variety of hypotheses that are found. Some are referred to as biochemical sorts of explanations. Then you have social explanations, socio-political explanations. You even have a person, Andrew Neher, N-E-H-E-R, that has this drum beat frequency hypothesis that's interesting. So that's what I'm looking for here. Number 40, we don't use the term primitive anymore because it's simply not accurate. It's not a PC thing. It's an accuracy thing. It's simply not accurate. Everyone around the world, all people, belong to the genus and species Homo sapiens. We all have the same range of intelligence, the same capacity for thought, and so forth. And really the only difference we may find will be differences in material culture. And that would be the tools people use in their technology, their clothes, and their housing, and so forth and so on, their means of production, etc. So, you can speak of some groups being less sophisticated than others, but only in regard to material culture. It certainly doesn't make sense to use the term primitive to describe an entire culture, because there are, for example, no primitive languages, there are no primitive religions, there are no primitive kinship systems, etc., etc. Okay? So it's an accuracy thing, as I like to say. Explain why cultural relativism leads conceptually to pluralism. Well, the way you would handle a question like this is first begin by defining each term. So state what cultural relativism is, state what pluralism is, or at least have those front and center in your mind, and then try to see if you can link the two by finding some common ground. And actually, you can go from one to the other, either way. I mean, with cultural relativism, the idea is that no one culture serves as the standard. Well, then if no one culture serves as the standard, then that means all cultures are okay. In other words, in their given context, all cultures are fine. And that would lead you to pluralism. Okay, so I'll read carefully what you wrote there and try to be fair. 42, the relevance to that conflict, to the general point, has to do with culture being accidental. That was the point of the Battle of Tours discussion. Because you may recall, I noted that had the Battle of Tours gone another way, namely had the Muslims prevailed, then a whole other history would have been realized. And Europe today possibly would have been Islamic. We would not have had the whole age of European exploration. Certainly it would not have played out the way it did. Who knows what would have happened to Christianity around the world. Etc., etc. Okay, so mainly the point being discussed there was that culture is accidental, but I'd like you to flesh it out a little bit more. All right, number 24. Make the argument that Poricari-Dohari is not actually a culture-bound syndrome. Well, that shouldn't have been too difficult, because as you read about Poricari-Dohari, I'm sure it struck you immediately that this was simply what we call breech birth. And of course, breech birth is a condition of birth that occurs universally in any culture. They just happen to have their own little twist on it in regard to interpreting what the issue is. Number 25, it's obviously a psychological disorder, quite simply because men's penises do not disappear. So I mean, it's certainly psychological. In other words, it can't be a physical disorder because, in fact, their genitals do not disappear. Okay, that's all I was looking for there, just something straightforward. 27, well, the most direct way, in fact, is simply to show that the symptoms of a supposed quote-unquote culture-bound syndrome are found in other areas. In other words, it's actually universal and not cultural. Number 27, if you recall from the video, I discussed the fact that in homogeneous cultures, there is sort of one standard culture that everyone embraces, as opposed to more heterogeneous cultures, like, for example, here in the United States, where there's lots of differing opinions, lots of cultural dissent, a huge divide, for example, in politics and so forth. And so in homogeneous cultures, since schizophrenia represents an estrangement from the cultural foundation of the group, well, it's easier to bring someone back to one solid, accepted cultural foundation, right? In other words, because everyone's on the same page. All right, so that's kind of what we're getting at there. And once again, you can go back and listen to what I had to say in the video lecture on that. Number 30, there's quite a few examples. I just asked you to give one. One example is the differential access to doctors among whites versus blacks. Also, infant mortality. So there's and there are other things too you could discuss. 28. A necessary cause must be present. A sufficient cause is all that has to be present in order to cause sickness. You need to sort of finish the thought there in order to cause sickness. Okay? 31. This is all about expectations and outcomes. The voodoo death is an example of the nocebo effect, and the idea there is that we have negative expectations, right? So with the voodoo death, everyone has a negative expectation. The hex is put on someone. Everyone fears for the worst, especially the victim, himself or herself. And we, in fact, get negative outcomes. So negative expectations lead to negative outcomes, and that's the reason why it's at the bottom left-hand corner. And contrast that with the upper right-hand corner. Positive expectations lead to positive outcomes with the placebo effect. Okay? Long answer questions. There were 2 of them, one for each unit. First, the three significant anthropological truths question. Well, if you go back and listen to the lectures for the first unit, I clearly state the 3, so it should have been really easy to find them, because in fact I identified them as such. The 3 significant anthropological truths. Anyway, so all I wanted you to do, and I used to be a bit more vague, but I've got to the point where I've been very, very explicit with exactly what I need you to do here. So I hope you follow my instructions. So quite simply, I'll give an example with the first one. The first one is the level of technological development is not indicative of intellectual capacity. Well, according to the instructions, I simply want you to write for your answer for part A, quote, the level of technological development of a certain group is indicative of intellectual capacity, right? So just follow the instructions literally. That's all I want you to do. In many cases, it just involves putting is not, or whatever. Changing a positive to a negative. And that's all I need you to do. Then I need you to go and explain to me why that negated version is problematic. Well, lots of information was given to you in that very long discussion videos. So let's continue with 1. So for example, with number 1, you couldn't argue that the level of technological development is indicative of intellectual capacity, namely because of the fact that there are very sophisticated languages, very sophisticated kinship systems, very sophisticated religions, etc., that are practiced and observed everywhere, amongst people everywhere. As I've mentioned already, there are no primitive people. And also, as I've already mentioned, the only among cultures is simply material culture, which in itself is rather superficial compared to everything else. You know, we're 99.9% genetically identical as a species. So those are things you could have mentioned. The negation for number 2 would be various components of culture are absolute. And then the negation for number 3 would be culture is passed down through biological inheritance. And of course, those two are false because I stated the negated version of each one. And then you need to go on and give me the points there that substantiate the negation. In other words, showing that the negation is incorrect. And as I said, lots of information there available for you on the videos. And then finally, the last question has to do with the 3 different models. That shouldn't have been too difficult. First, I want you to describe in detail and the 3 different models. And then state which one you think is the most valid and explain why. Well, the exclusivist model actually is a sort of either-or model. It's either culture-bound or it's not. The inclusionist nature-culture continuum basically says that a variety, there can be a variety of sources for the causes of sickness, ranging from the very cultural to the very natural and biological. And they all play a part, although it's important to note that no malady is strictly cultural and no malady is strictly biological. So that's why we say they don't recognize the culture-bound syndrome notion. And then, of course, the last one, the inclusionist multiple aspect, simply says that all these various factors contribute equally to sickness. All the cultural and natural and biological factors all contribute equally. And then I want to see an argument from you. Tell me which one you think is the most valid. By the way, Hahn likes the inclusionist the inclusionist nature-culture continuum model. I too, and in fact most ethnomedical scholars would argue that the nature-culture continuum model is the most accurate for a number of reasons. It's much easier to defend that model than the other two. So we'll see what you have to say.